Okay, well, welcome back to class. In this session, those of you that are watching online, we hope you've stayed with us to this point, and we have some of the best yet to cover in the remainder of chapter 11 of Daniel, and then we will finish up Daniel 12 in the following class. But today we're going to finish up the very long chapter of Daniel 11. Keep in mind that this entire prophecy begins in chapter 10, where Daniel set himself for 3 weeks. He didn't intend it to be 3 weeks, but it turned out to be 3 weeks of prayer and fasting and thinking and meditation before he finally was visited by the angelic messengers that began to give him this long prophecy. So what begins in chapter 10 is now in chapter 11. We've covered quite a bit of this, and we are down at this section that begins in verse 40, where it says, "At the time of the end, the king of the south shall push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, with horsemen, with many ships." And just again, by review, we are focused in Daniel 11 upon these two kings, the king of the north, the king of the south. The king of the north being the successors to, within the Greek Empire of the General Seleucus, one of Alexander the Great's 4 generals who founded the dynasty up here in Syria, essentially, and becomes the king of the north, the king of the south, under Ptolemy, the other one of the other generals of Alexander, with his empire at the south. And the chapter discusses and chronicles in detail the back and forth conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south during this period of time, after Alexander's death, and then leading up to actually all the way to the time of the end. The last time we showed that beginning in verse 35, there's a transition that was made in terms of the king of the north becoming directly the Roman Empire, and I covered how that can be understood from history, that this shift from the Seleucid or Greek Empire to the Roman Empire can be documented historically to support our understanding and our interpretation of this prophecy, that now at verse 40, when we are talking about the king of the south pushing at him, we can identify that as the king of the north. I should just interject that other interpreters of Daniel, beginning with verse 35 to the end of the chapter in this conflict, they identify 3 kings, and others 2 kings. We go with the interpretation of 2 kings, which has been the pattern within the entire chapter. And the change of wording in verse 35 to him can as well apply to the king of the north when you understand the prophetic flow of the book of Daniel from Babylon to Persia, to Greece, and to Rome in the 4th empire of Daniel 7, his dream being Rome. I think that apart from certain interpretations of the grammar and the way the structure of Daniel 11:35 forward, I think some of the interpretations that lead people to, let's say, 3 kings in part, comes from just an inability to lock in on the little horn of Daniel 7 being the papacy, identifying that power that is connected to the 4th beast of Daniel's dream, and the growing influence and what develops in Rome with the empire, and then the rise of a different Christian church, or a false Christian church, in the subsequent ages after the time of the book of Acts, after the 1st century AD, and a different Christianity and a different church that that is centered in Rome and becomes Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, with the papacy, etc., and that story of the church. The inability, reluctance, or whatever it might be of certain interpreters to admit that, to hold on to that, I think clouds people's interpretation as they look at this section. But be that as it may, that has been our traditional interpretation, and I think it's correct. And we will see that as we return to this when we come into the book of Revelation, later on in the class structure here and the other series that we will be taping. And so we look at these systems here as the King of the North being a European-based power that has many different revivals, that is attacked by this power called the King of the South again, that in terms of history and even the current geopolitical scene, as we are in 2024, about to turn the page here in a few weeks to 2025, looking at all of that, it has to be a Muslim-based, Islamic-based power that rises out of the Middle East that would include Egypt, which was the center of the ancient King of the South, but other aspects of it going all the way really to other parts of the world with the spread of Islam. And we did talk last time about the different historical attacks or incursions by Islam out of this region into Europe, attempting to spread Islam, conquer all other nations according to the faith of Muhammad. The first one being stopped in the year 732 in what is now France in the Battle of Tours. And then two other occasions in 1529 and 1683 where Ottoman armies came up through the Balkan area of Europe, attempting from that route to conquer Europe, and both times were stopped at Vienna, what is Vienna, Austria. So when we look at history, that's what we see. And coupled with what we can understand about this battle, and then what the current geopolitical scene is, if we have a futuristic interpretation of Daniel, this section of Daniel, which we do, then looking realistically at the history and the current scene, that has to be what we anticipate ahead of us. Some type of situation where there is an Islamic-based attack out of that part of the world, what we call the Middle East, into and against a power based in Europe that can galvanize that power, bring it together, and will result in an attack by this northern power into the region of the Middle East, and specifically upon Israel and Jerusalem, thus bringing in other prophecies that we have touched on in Daniel and in the 70 weeks prophecy, as well as what we will see in the book of Revelation. And so, with that, as we look at this, let's move on to verse 41. That's a bit of a review. It says that he, this king of the north, this northern power, with a base in Europe, will enter the glorious land. That's a reference to the glorious land being the land of Israel, the land that was promised to Abraham, his descendants, today being the state of Israel politically, with its capital at Jerusalem. He will enter there. Again, either one of our other presenters or other writers on Bible prophecy, I'm not going to say that we invented the term, but the idea that Jerusalem is the bullseye of Bible prophecy does fit, in that the very bullseye, the center of the target of biblical prophecy is Jerusalem and this area. And everything focuses there at the time of the end. And this is where we begin to see that. And so many other prophecies that will deal with this. That's why we should be understanding, watching, seeking to understand the Middle East, things that happen to the state of Israel, and why we will, in our publications, write a great deal about that. But we're not the only ones. I mean, other students of Bible prophecy do, but to be honest, historians and geopolitical thinkers, governments, America, Britain, others, they focus on Jerusalem, Israel as well. And in our recent times, obviously, last year, there's been a major battle going on between Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon, proxies of Iran, as they are seeking to eradicate, to destroy the Jewish state. That is the avowed, stated in their charters, purpose of Iran, and they are working at that, and to essentially push them into the sea. When you hear the phrase from the mountains to the sea, that is a chant of protesters who are in support of Palestinians and Hamas on college campuses and in the news today. That's the idea, pushing all of it out, pushing the Jewish state into the sea, into the Mediterranean. In other words, obliterating it. It's why Iran is rapidly seeking to develop a nuclear weapon, and they have said they will use it. They will use it on Israel. That's why they are developing it. These are very real possibilities, and God forbid it happens, but the likelihood continues to grow more so continually. Anyway, how that will fit into biblical prophecies, obviously when this event takes place, the state of Israel still exists at verse 41 of Daniel. But another power has come in because of a provocation, and there will be other matters, political matters at play to do this. And I'm going to wait till Revelation to go in more detail about Europe and what we might expect there. We've touched on that when we were in Daniel 7. But let's just say that at this time, we're looking at a European-based power making this incursion into the glorious land. And it says, going on in verse 41, many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand. Now, this is an interesting passage. These shall escape from his hand. And it mentions Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. Now, from your studies in the Old Testament, these names should not be unfamiliar to you. These are nations that they were historical tribal nations that were enemies of Israel. They were enemies of Israel as they came into the Promised Land after the Exodus and in subsequent generations. And we see them in the story of the Old Testament, Edom, Moab, and the children of Ammon. Those ancient nations today are a part of what is the political state of Jordan. And that is the light-colored section that is outlined on the map that you see on the screen. And those of you that are watching this, will be popped up on the screen. And so you're looking at a map where you see Israel to the left and the political boundaries of the state of Israel. And then the lighter yellow with the red line around it is the nation of Jordan. And within Jordan are the ancient nations, the territories of Edom and Moab. If you would ever go to Jordan and do any touring around, you will travel through ancient Edom and Moab. And, if you've got a good tour guide, you're probably going to be on a biblical tour, maybe a church tour, and they will point that out to you. I've had that a couple of times in 2 trips that I've made to Jordan over the years. And it's well known, well established fact. And so here in Daniel 11:41, this area escapes the hand of the king of the north when it comes in. In other words, if you look at the political line there, that theoretically would be then as far as the king of the north goes. They don't go any further into what is Jordan. Okay? Now, that we're not told why. Why stop there? Why are these 3 countries singled out? If we have a futuristic view of this prophecy, which we do, then it's a good question to ask. And if you look at this map, just to kind of look at the map of Jordan there, you see it's kind of an odd shape, right? It looks like it was drawn, the boundaries looks like they were drawn by somebody coming off of a weekend drunken binge. They couldn't draw a straight line, all right? And you see how this happened. Now, just real briefly, I will tell you that boundary of the modern nation of Jordan was drawn by diplomats after World War I. It's a fascinating story in history as to how the nation of Jordan came into existence. But these weird lines were drawn by diplomats, many of whom did not really understand the ethnic and religious boundaries of the tribes and the peoples of what then was called Transjordan, a region that was a part of the called the British Mandate, and came under that after the war. Actually, this had been up to World War I. That section, that whole area, had been part of the old Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was handled out of Istanbul, part of an Islamic power that actually what went up into Europe, historically, but the headquarters at Istanbul, ancient Constantinople or Byzantium, Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire ruled all of this. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. And so the Allied powers, led by Great Britain and the United States and the French, they redrew the map of the Middle East, is what they did. They created Jordan. They also created Iran and Lebanon and Syria in terms of just defining those current states. But in particular, as you look at Jordan, they didn't take into account ethnic and tribal differences, which is a part of the reason why that is a very fractious political state today. But one of the reasons it was created, in fact, a prime reason that it was created, was to provide let's say, a land for a group of Arabs called the Hashemites, and a king who actually lived down in Saudi Arabia, way down in here. And because of the promises and the political shenanigans, we'll call it that, of the time and the agreements, they wanted to give him a land. They actually gave his son, this king's son, Iran. And he was the king of Iran until, I think, the mid-30s when they killed him, drug his body through the streets. But they gave the King Abdullah this kingdom of Jordan. And it is the same kingdom today. His great-grandson, I believe, or great-great-grandson, I could be corrected on that, the current King Abdullah, his same name, is the current monarch or king of Jordan. The most famous king of Jordan was Hussein. Some of you may be familiar with that name, King Hussein of Jordan. He died a few years ago, but he reigned for a long time, survived multiple assassinations, and his son today is Abdullah, who is now the king. Now, there's a reason I set all this up. Jordan was created as in a sense, a refuge for that family to fulfill a promise, but they kind of moved there and set up shop. It's kind of a fabricated, artificial monarchy and state. I mean, he was already a king, but they created the state for him to be there. And it's been an uneasy situation since the 1920s, even to this very day. Jordan has historically been an ally of America. We pump a lot of money into Jordan. They have agreements with Israel, both known and unknown. That's another part of the story. But they share a common border. The Hashemite family, they actually control the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The Gold Dome, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the famous picture you see of Jerusalem, that is actually, that spot of land is actually technically controlled by the Jordanian king and his family. That's part of the treaty and the arrangements there. But my point is this. His family were a group of refugees in search of a throne and a country. The Allied powers gave it to them. Now, interestingly, since that time, the 1920s, refugees from many other countries have settled in Jordan. In 1948, when the State of Israel came into existence, the Palestinians, the part of this great cause of the Palestinian cause, many who were uprooted, etc., wound up in Jordan as refugees. And they're in camps to this day. When I was in Jordan, you drive by One section of the city of Ammon, which, by the way, Ammon, Jordan, takes its name from the people of Ammon, as referenced here in verse 41. And interesting history and stories behind all of that back in the Old Testament. But probably, at least at the time I saw it, it was the largest refugee camp was right in downtown Amman, Jordan, the capital of Jordan, of Palestinian refugees, and they're all over. Since the war of 1990, the Gulf Wars of 1990, and then 1990, the first war was Bush Sr., 1990, 91, first Gulf War, then the second Gulf War, George Bush, W. Bush, the son of Bush Sr., went into the Middle East and uprooted Saddam Hussein in the nation of Iraq. And all of those created additional refugees, is my point. And so if you look at the northern border of Jordan right there, there's refugee camps all along there with Syria because of Syrian refugees from the Syrian civil war, from Iraq. And when I was there in Jordan, the last time I was there, the driver who took me to the airport, got to talking with him, and he was from Russia. His ethnicity was Circassian, an ethnic group way up in Russia who, in a sense, were kicked out during communist days. They found refuge in Jordan. Okay? Now, the current king, Abdullah, I mentioned, his wife was also a refugee from Kuwait, down here in the Persian Gulf. Make sure I got it right down here. She was a refugee out of the first Gulf War of 1990. Her family fled to Jordan. She was working in a bank, and whatever, she met the current king. He started dating her. They got married. Okay? So she's Kuwaiti, a refugee. I keep using the term refugee. I want you to understand there's a reason. I'm going to come back to that. Now, this nation is made up of refugees. Okay? In very large part from the king all the way down. Why does the king of the north, why is it halted right there? Why does it not take over this? Are we being told something? I don't know. Possibly we are. What could we possibly infer from that? Well, let me tell you, beginning in the 2nd century A.D., early church writings, church teachers, one of them prominently named Jerome. He's high on the list of what are called the church fathers. Looked at Daniel, and at verse 41, and they surmised, along with verses in the Gospels of the time of the end, particularly Matthew 24, those, when Jerusalem is surrounded by armies, those who are in Jerusalem, where do they flee? Anybody know? It says to the mountains. Flee to the mountains. The only way you flee from the mountains, if you're in Jerusalem, is to the east, into Moab, Edom, the mountains of Moab and the mountains of Edom. Do you know what's in the mountains of Moab and Edom? In southern Jordan? Anybody know? Anybody know your geography of Jordan? In southern Jordan, there's a place called Petra. Anybody ever heard the name Petra? Okay. There's a place called Petra. All right, you ever see you've seen the Indiana Jones movie, the ending of The Last Crusade? Everybody knows that, right? They ride their horses through the Siq, and this is what you see. You see the treasury there. So this is that's where Petra is, okay? It's in the south. Now, Jerome, this guy way back in the 2nd century, he looked at all these scriptures. Guess what he concluded? That Edom and Moab could be a place of refuge for the people of God referenced in the Gospels. Those who are in Judea, flee to the mountains. 2nd century AD. That's a long time ago. Other interpreters of Scripture, and into the modern day, other Protestant and evangelical interpreters of the Bible and prophecy, have also looked at that same verse and others, that notably Isaiah 16, that talk about hiding the outcasts. And they conclude that possibly this place called Petra could be a place of refuge for the people of God. And looking at other scriptures like Revelation 3, where the church is taken into the wilderness for times and half a time. And that's been a historic interpretation from the 2nd century forward, and has been an interpretation of the Church of God in our time as well. Now, come back to the question. Why does the king of the north halt right here? I don't know. But it's interesting what others have concluded, what even the church has concluded. It's also interesting what Scripture says. It's also interesting, is Petra this place where Revelation 3 says it's her place. We'll talk more about that in Revelation 3. Is the land of Jordan the location for a refuge of the people of God during a time of tribulation, which we're talking about here? Well, it's been the interpretation from the 2nd century forward. All right? That much we know for sure, and certainly for the Church of God. I don't know. I've been there twice. There are really some nice hotels around there, so if that is a place where the biblical place, then I've got some Holiday Inn points that I keep saving up for my own, just in case, because I'd rather stay in a Holiday Inn than a cave in this location here. I've been in some of those caves and some scary things in those caves. If you ever get a chance to go to Jordan, you've got to go to Petra. I've been there twice. Anyway, I always like to insert this at this point in the story. The Scripture says that the church will be protected in what is called her place during the tribulation. This has been an interpretation for a long, long period of time. We did not invent that in the church. So what we might conclude from that, I think my ultimate conclusion is we'll wait and see what God has in mind. The Scripture is true. God will protect His people. The church will go to what is called her place, and we'll see what that is at that particular time. And so, looking at all of this, it's all quite interesting. All right, let's go on to verse 42 of Daniel. Now it says, "He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps." Now these are 3 countries that are still geographically defined on the map today. This is Egypt. Libya is right next to Egypt on the west, borders it on the west, and Ethiopia is down to the south of Egypt. And so we've already understood through Daniel 11 that the king of the south was based in Egypt. We are expanding that to include other Arab states and nations in this end-time king of the south, but there are explicit references to this section. Now, Egypt is a very powerful Arab state. Up until recent years, Egypt was kind of the center of Arab nationalism and Arab resistance against the West. That mantle passed with the Islamic Revolution of 1979 to Iran and the Shiite clerical dictatorship that has been controlling Iran since 1979. They're the ones developing the nuclear weapon. But Egypt is still very powerful. They're still in play. It's been Iran that's making the push against not only Israel but the West. But when this time happens, and here's the point to understand, we are given explicit details of geography and states in this prophecy in the context of some very general but very big geopolitical movements that are occurring with the king of the south attacking the king of the north, and the king of the north coming in here. And it's the overall thing is very general. And there are many other scriptures that dovetail into the explanations here that we are to in a sense, synchronize, particularly in the book of Revelation. And we'll do that when we get to Revelation chapter 9, chapter 16 especially, and 13 to understand the background to this power we call the beast that comes into the Middle East and attacks and does what it does, and what a lot of that can mean. But there's a lot that is very, very general as we look at this. And so he stretches out his hand against these countries. And this map shows Egypt and Libya and Ethiopia, where he comes into them. All right? And it says in verse 43, he shall have power over the treasures, or the hidden treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Now, that's an enigmatic verse. What does that mean? Egypt is not known for a lot of gold and silver, not even a lot of oil. Libya, yes. But some interpreters, and I don't know that I agree with this necessarily, but if you look at Egypt, the treasures of Egypt are largely historical. You got the pyramids, you've got the artifacts in the Egyptian Museum of all aspects of ancient Egypt that include gold and silver. Some interpreters kind of attach that to verse 43 here. I wouldn't exclude it, but I'm not sure that that's the entire meaning here. It's not exactly clear. One thing is clear is what it says in the first part of the sentence, he shall have power. And I think that's probably what we should focus on as we look at this. This is an international power exerting itself into this region militarily and politically at a critical moment in world history. Something happens to create this push by the south against the north. This provocation by the king of the south, likely some type of a terrorist event that threatens order. And this is what I want to focus you on. It threatens order, world order. I've mentioned this as we've talked about Rome. Roman Empire is all about order. Order. In other words, control. Keep things, different peoples, different religions, different ethnicities, etc., languages. Roman Empire had it all. But they had to keep it under tight control, which hence the kingdom of iron, as represented in Nebuchadnezzar's dream of Daniel 2, this system of iron. Rome's all about order. And if anything threatened that, they came down like iron and stamped it out, a rod of iron. Well, look, in the future, some type of a political terroristic event that threatens world order will galvanize nations into doing things that they would not normally diplomatically, politically have as part of their plan in order to preserve order. I like to liken it to, if anything keeps people from going to Disney World, whether it's in California, Florida, France, Hong Kong, I think I've got them all covered there, that gets people excited. They're going to make sure that they get to Disney World. You can't go to Disney World, we're in trouble, right? Hurricane comes through Florida, Disney World shuts down maybe 1-2 days? But you got there anyway, because it's got to keep going. Something will threaten world order. In other words, it will threaten our money, our economy, our way of life. And that can't happen. What this power is all about. And this power comes in. And this is what to focus on in verse 43. And, many ways to understand and look at what is taking place here. So he comes in into these areas here. Now, verse 44, it says, but tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and to utterly make away many. Again, think power, threats from the east and from the north. If we look at this map and understand geographically as we look at prophecy, directions are normally taken from Jerusalem, from the east and the north. And you draw a line east and north out of Israel today, you wind up in the purple area on this map, which is Russia, China, Asia, that part of Asia. Something out of the east and the north arises. What we have here is a movement of nations and armies that are taking place and beginning to move, all right? And so it says, he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. That's Jerusalem. But he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. All right? So that brings us to the end of chapter 11, but the story's not over there. But it says he will come to his end, and none shall help him. Now we've got a lot of general statements made about some big movements that we can break down with other prophecies. One of them happens to be in Revelation chapter 9 and verse 13, with the sounding of the sixth angel and a voice from the four horns of the golden altar before God, and four angels who had been prepared for an hour, a day, a month, and a year were released to kill a third of mankind. And the number of the army of the horsemen was 200 million, and I heard the number of them. And so we'll cover this in detail in Revelation, but this is where you would put this section of this sounding of this trumpet in the context of Daniel 11, verses 43 and 44. All right? So there's a bit more detail given to us by Revelation chapter 9. And it's a movement of an army of horsemen of 200 million, and it's coming from this direction. And Revelation also talks about Euphrates drying up, but it's a movement of armies and military attack in this direction, again, focused on Jerusalem. Now, it says a 200 million man army. That's a lot of people. I'll save any further comment on that one to Revelation chapter 19, but this is where you're going to put this. There's one other reference in Revelation 16, verse 12, the sounding of the sixth angel of the seven trumpet plagues. He pours out his bowl on the river Euphrates, and his water was dried up so that the way of the kings from the east might be prepared. These are these rumblings, these tidings that disturb the king of the north coming out of the east and the north. This is what Revelation 16 has to say about it. And they come from the east, and saying the sixth angel who had the trumpet released the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. This is the origin of the term release the Kraken. Anybody ever heard that term before? Release the Kraken. Well, the Kraken in this case is these armies that are driven by the power of Satan and the spirits that go out of his mouth to the kings of the nations and gather them together here in Revelation chapter 16 and chapter 9 to bring together this particular situation that we see here is occurring in the area of the Middle East. So there you go. With those particular lines, they're coming out of that direction. I will make one comment, because it is so current. Earlier this year, again, going back to the war between Israel, state of Israel, and Iran back in March or April this year, 2024, as I'm talking, Iran launched some drones, several hundred drones from their nation over here directly at Israel. And I remember watching it, and they were slow-moving drones at top speed about 100 miles an hour. These were not, large supersonic type missiles. They launched more than 100 or so at the state of Israel. They triggered, or they announced what was happening. Everybody was watching them move across the map, and Israel shot down most of them. They didn't do any damage. But I remember watching it and think, wow. I read Revelation, a 200 million man army coming out of this area. And so I'm watching this map, And moving along the map were these drones. And the firepower of those drones, or even larger drones, can certainly equal a 200 million man army. Now, I'm not saying that that's what it is. I will say that's kind of my speculation. Is that what the 200 million man army means when it says that? The power of a 200 million? Look, keep in mind that Daniel and John later in Revelation is inspired to use the technology of their ancient world, chariots, horsemen, to describe the movements of armies and battles in these prophetic events. We're not dealing with chariots and horses in 2024. Sophisticated military technology is what we have. This is, chalk that up to the column of speculation, DMAC speculation, and as to what that scripture might mean. But I remember looking at that earlier this year, and I'm thinking, and I'm watching Revelation, is one of my first thoughts of firepower moving against Israel. Now, it didn't do anything at that time. They since had another rocket barrage that really didn't do anything either. We'll probably see more. So this power comes to an end, verse 45 says. Let me point out one other thing. Various interpreters of Daniel 11 that say this king of the north at this time is only historical and is actually talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, the fourth. The fact that he comes to an end in the glorious land nixes the idea that Daniel 11 is only historical and ends with Antiochus. Because Antiochus did not die in the land of Israel. Antiochus died over here in Persia someplace. We know that from history. And so verse 45 of Daniel 11 can't be talking about he or the king of the north or whatever, is not talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, the king of the north of the earlier verses of Daniel 11. It's just one of those things to realize that the scene jumps to the end of the age, and that this king of the north, whoever he is now, and we've identified that, is different from that of the Syrian king Antiochus. So with that, we'll kind of wrap it up at Daniel 11, verse 45. And we've only scratched the surface of what we could have covered in this chapter. But keep in mind that the prophecy continues. And so in the next class, we'll go into Daniel chapter 12 and wrap up the book of Daniel with the concluding revelations to him and what we might learn from that. So we'll deal with that in the next class.